I mean, this is what's sort of interested me since the very beginning of my PhD. So in terms of giving you an idea of how this sort of came around, when I started, the SD40 was an idea that didn't have, so a lot of what clinicians will do right now is they'll look at a specific portion of the ST segment and say, if that specific portion of the ST segment changes this much, you have ischemia here, depending on which electrodes that shows up on.
Okay.
The nice thing that SD40 does on top of that is it augments which point you look at depending on the heart rate. So as your heart rate increases, your T wave gets closer to your QRS, right? So if you're looking at the same fixed point, say 60 milliseconds after the J point, as the T wave encroaches, the ST value is going to increase just because it's sliding up the T wave, independent of any other principle. Mm-hmm. Right. So there's a couple ways of adjusting for that fact. But the way that we like doing that and the way we've done it is with ST40. So we look at a percentage. So as the T wave hinges forward, the point we're looking at hinges forward. Right. So hopefully we're looking at the same relative position in the action potential rather than just a point in the electrogram space. So it's more of an action potential based metric. So that's kind of nice, because there's physiology based on, action potential and action potential differences. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And then I imagine the paper you read was the paper that came out when I was sort of early in my PhD that showed that the ST40 is indeed a good metric for detecting ischemia.
Yeah.
My research since then has called some things into question with that, but it's still probably, I would say, the gold standard for detecting ischemic stress within the wall of the heart. So before I get into things that are going to sort of go against that, I just wanted to say that up front. Okay. So yeah, metrics. So this whole talk's about metrics, and a metric is just a system or a standard of measurement. It's very simple. We use metrics all the time. I'll be going into a few classes of metrics, but there's almost unlimited classes of metrics and ways to apply it. So I sort of just want to get your mind thinking in a metric type space, and also eventually how to compare metrics. So if we have all these ways of measuring something, what is the best measure for that something, right? And every field has their metrics, every field has measures of those metrics, and every field debates which metrics are better. So yeah, I assure you, I will not be stopping that argument, right? People will always come up with metrics, and people will always say their metrics are better than the previous metrics. And hopefully that's true as well. Hopefully we're going towards a better metric world, but it's not a perfect world. For example, okay. Moving on. Okay, so just to give you an idea of a few metrics and to perhaps give you some background into, so economics was always something that has tons of metrics. One thing that I always thought was very interesting was what metrics, what countries are, what metrics certain countries talk about. In America, we almost exclusively talk about GDP. In Thailand, where I went to high school, we talk about the Human Development Index. So how advanced your society is, what measures are in society to help society along. But America has the highest GDP, so why would we report anything else? We're 27 when it comes to the Human Development Index, so we should report GDP. UK probably finds a metric that really capitalizes on fish and chips prevalence, right? So they're going to report that metric and then say they're the best country in the world. So America, we have the highest GDP and the highest GDP per capita, so those are the metrics we use, right? It's all marketing in the end, right? Okay, so a metric here, with my definition of what I'm going to be sort of calling a metric, is a measurement of quantity or quality to be used for further interpretation. So just to give you an idea of things, probably the metric I think is probably the most fun in terms of what the hell they're talking about is a pack year. When I went to a talk that talked about a pack year, and so this is the equivalent of smoking 1 pack a day for an entire year. And so it gives clinicians sort of an exposure to tobacco. So they look at
those are totally relevant. We use those all the time.
No, I know. I'm not saying
all the time.
I'm not saying they're not relevant. It's just when I first heard it. I first heard it. Go ahead.
You meet people that have like 120 pack year history, right? So that's like 2 packs a day.
2 packs a day for 60 years, or
Yeah.
120 packs a day for 1 year.
40 years. Yeah.
Yeah. So that gives you a really good measure of somebody's exposure to cigarettes over a lifetime, or somebody who's 21 but smokes 5 packs a day. You can say, okay, well, you're in this category, or whatever it is, right? Because you can imagine how that metric's used. Something we're hopefully all aware of is a Yelp review and sort of the fragility of that, but it is a metric, right? It shows what a population's interest in something is, not necessarily how good a restaurant is, even though I think I said that right there. So what I said that metric is actually wrong, I would say. But GDP, so the value of goods, GDP per capita, the value of goods divided by individuals, you can think about how those different things can be sold and marketed in different ways. Countries that have abnormally high GDP per capita, Singapore. So guess what metric Singapore probably talks about? GDP per capita.
Gotta be number one.
Yeah, they're number one or number two, or they're up at there, right? But of course, when it comes to GDP, Singapore is a city, right? So tiny. So GDP per capita is what Singapore likes to lean on, right? These next three are things that are just the basic statistics, but also something that's used by our government as well in order to reporting certain things. And the differences in these values have pretty significant social economic influences. So if you think about what the difference between the modal income, mean income, and median income are, you can tell a different story, right? Hey, Rob.
Hey.
We called it. We figured it was a bike ride.
Well, it was a bike ride to go talk to the local sort of head of police up here.
Oh, geez.
It was kind of a business bike ride.
Oh, well?
No, it was fine. It's fine.
Okay. So I'm introducing metrics, and I'm starting with metrics that are more standard, and I'm talking about how metrics can be used to report different things. And things I've mentioned in the past are how European countries like to focus on economic measures like the Human Development Index, whereas America likes focusing on the GDP. Singapore likes focusing on GDP per capita because they all tell a story that we're awesome. And so depending on, So the thing I was just getting into is the differences between modal, mean, and median income, right? And I've always thought this was really fun. And I'm curious to hear what you guys think. What do you think the modal income in America is? The most common income?
Low.
Like 30K per year, probably.
Probably 0.
Oh, geez.
It depends on how you bin, obviously. But if you bin it, it's less than minimum wage is our modal income. If you bin it as full-time employment, so you're only counted if you're full-time employment, then it's minimum wage, right? Minimum wage is the most common wage. Like most people have that.
So unsurprised, capitalism does exactly what you'd expect it to.
Okay, now mean, which is vulnerable to outliers. What is the mean?
Are we including Bezos?
Yeah.
Yes, that's what a mean does.
$100 billion.
No, mean for America. There's still 350 million of us, and only one of him.
Isn't it like $63,000 a year?
That's capita, but it's about 50. Yeah. Mean income, or 50 or 60, you're right. It's in that range. Yeah.
Yeah.
How about median? So if the mean is 50 to 60, what's median?
It's more like 45.
Yeah, it's like 32. I think.
Oh.
So I think, or it might be 35, but regardless, it's about half, right?
So Lindsay is making more money than us, and so she is making above the median income. Is that what we're saying?
Yeah.
Yep.
Above middle income. Yeah, exactly.
I just like always making that point very clear.
Oh.
Okay.
So
Get a better grant next time, Brian.
Yeah, it's okay, Lindsay. I can't do more push-ups than you.
See? They pay the push-up doers the big bucks.
Wait a minute. There's a whole military thing that we could go down a rabbit. Anyways, sorry. Okay.
So we all have metrics. We all use metrics. I'd be surprised if you didn't use a metric today, honestly. But what are some metrics you guys know of and can think of? There's almost no wrong answers here. Well, I say that, but I'm sure there are tons. But so I'm curious to hear what you guys have to say.
Like, and we're talking metrics from like anything.
Anything, and just and explain what it measures, just to give you an idea of what the metric is.
Miles per gallon, gas mileage.
Yep, exactly.
Miles per hour, speed.
Yep. Yeah. So
Height count.
weight. I mean, there's all these tons of metrics we can think of, right? So there's another thing we can do. Oh, go ahead. Do you want to keep going, Jake?
Kevin Bacon factor.
Yeah, the Kevin Bacon factor, the hamburger index.
Yeah.
Like what if a Big Mac, if McDonald's is so well organized, a Big Mac should cost the same in every country, but it doesn't. So what does that tell you about a country? That's a prevailing economic measure.
Like its currency value, probably.
It's how inflated their currency is relative to their buying power, I believe, is what it essentially comes out to be. So, Iceland doesn't go, the Iceland kroner, the currency in Iceland doesn't go very far, and so they end up having to pay a lot for their Big Macs relative to us. They pay $12 for their Big Macs, where we pay whatever $4.50 or whatever it is, right? So it tells you something about their economy. So yeah, there's totally off the wall metrics too in that regard. So, okay. So there's also, we can think about how to visualize metrics or how to bin them in different ways. And a lot of those metrics that I talked about in the previous slides could be binned in either a temporal framework or a spatial framework or both, depending on how you visualize it, right? So for example, I'm going to show you a metric, which is what was it? I believe, number of cardiovascular deaths in the country. And, you can start to tell a story based on how you display the temporal evolution of a metric or the spatial evolution. Right here, it's a pretty simple story, right? From 1980 to 2015 or so, heart disease deaths went down. There's not much more to that story other than that. That's a good story to tell, and I think it tells it well. Now, what about space does it not tell you? Do you think this is homogeneous across the entire country? So something about space will tell us how this is, obviously it varies across space. And then you can imagine some combination, right? So let's look at heart disease over space at a single time instance. And if you've known my rants of spatial metrics, you'll know my favorite saying on this is, think of a bad metric and then look at it on a map, and it's basically going to look exactly like this map, no matter what that metric is. And like I've done this where people have come up with metrics. I'll Google the map, and then it'll look almost exactly like this map, right? So that tells you something spatially about the map more so than it does the metric itself, right? Something about this region down here being particularly bad when it comes to bad metrics. But this tells you a very different story. And then you could look at this over time, for example, to get a spatial temporal idea of how heart disease has changed in the country. Has the South always had an extremely high prevalence of heart disease? I don't know. Is it something since the 80s? That's something that a temporal analysis could tell you, right? Does that make sense? Okay, so you can plot these metrics over space, but you can also do metrics on top of the metrics, right? So, and I tried to come up with a general word for that, and I'm not sure if there is one, and if there is, I didn't find it, but I've called it second order metrics or performance measures. And so we're now looking at GDP per capita for the United States from 1929, a relevant time point, to 2012, another relevant time point. This tells a story, right? There are measures we can do on this curve to tell us something about what we're looking at, right? Are there features in this curve that are significant, do you think? Feel free to, yeah. What are some features that stick out to you?
Yeah, I was gonna say the local minimums and maximums over like kind of the shorter time spans. You can see depressions and
the time at which the U.S. entered the war.
Yeah.
Yeah,
We're over there.
Well, that's when we started supplying the war and not actually putting anything in. But yes, that is when our GDP uptook. Yes, we joined the war. Halfway through that upstroke or so, or sorry, like 75% through that upstroke, right? Halfway. But it doesn't matter. So yes. Now, how about the Great Depression, which is that local minimum at the very beginning of the curve, and the recession that we lived through? Right, you can do a measure to know which one affected the GDP more, some sort of local area under the curve or something like that, right? Right, so now we're doing a measure on top of the measure to infer something else, right? Does that make sense? And you can imagine doing that for tons of measures, and I'll show you how we've done that as well. Does that make sense? Okay, and now, so we're going to get into fiducial-based metrics. So this is metrics based on a time point in a beat. So we're going to be going over specifically electrogram-based metrics, but for the sake of generalizing, I'm going to call them fiducial-based metrics. So how about metrics for ischemia? So these are a few examples of different beats over all runs in an episode, colored by the temporal progression into that episode. So we're looking at a single electrode, and then we plot each subsequently recorded beat over the course of an ischemic episode. And then we color each overlaid beat by the time that corresponds to that time in the episode. So early episodes have this magenta color, and later beats have this red color, right? So you can see a progression from what we know, and if you've seen enough of our signals, what we call healthy, to these very abnormal signals, right? And we just have 6 examples here and 10 along a needle down at the bottom there, showing the variability. These are the same episode of ischemia, I'm pretty sure. And these are just different electrodes in different positions during that same episode of ischemia. And so you can begin to see a pretty complex picture in that the response to ischemia is not necessarily isolated to one time point. Right, I can find a few that will definitely experience that ST depression that we know and love, but I can also show you signals that will experience a massive propagation change, but will then experience an ST depression. So this game is a lot more complicated than we sort of let on. Any questions here before I move on?
Or just real quick, for part B, each one is a separate needle, right?
It's a separate electrode on a needle. And the numbers don't correspond to where on the needle. I think they're just scattered about. It's just 6 examples. They're not on the same needle or anything like that. But then the one on the bottom is just the needle and how they look across the wall. And I believe they're different episodes of ischemia, technically, the top one and the bottom one, but that doesn't matter. So I just wanted to show you with this that they're very diverse, the response to ischemia. So this got me interested in, well, is ST40 truly the best way to do this? How about if we look at other metrics? How do they respond? So one thing the language I decided to go about that is using what we refer to as run metrics. So I wanted a way to capture and distill the evolution of a metric over a given episode of ischemia. And by tracking a time point over the course of a single episode of ischemia, here I'm tracking the ST40 value, right? Those yellow circles are the ST40 value. And you can see as the heart rate increased, that value hinged forward, right? Yes, and so we're looking at there, and then we look on the left, and we plot that value of the ST40 segment over the course of the ischemic episode, and we see a monotonic increase in the value of that metric, right? And that allows us to do, and just so this down here is is a manifold generated from some machine learning algorithm that sort of distills all of the beats captured across all electrodes into this single shape, right? But using this single shape, I can track a single time point, right? I don't lose my temporal progression, right? And these colors are capturing the progression through the episode, and a sort of this counterclockwise traversal through the shape is a progression through the beat, right? So it's just the machine learning. But the take-home message is that I can distill the transformation in this very complex space into a single one-dimensional curve called a run metric. And now I can look at how this above curve compares versus the bottom curve, right? I have a language for now comparing metrics. Does that make sense?
So I do have a question regarding the manifold.
Yep.
Why is it that people do the manifold? Like personally, I look at it, I'm like, it looks like a shape, but there isn't. I don't gain much meaning behind it other than that. Like, what is the illustration for?
Yeah. So there's a couple reasons. One reason, for example, is when we're looking at that shape, we're looking at the change of 247 electrodes over in a typical episode of ischemia in the same amount of pixels that we're looking at a single electrode over an episode of ischemia. So we've distilled quite a lot of information into a single snapshot, right? And in addition to that, machine learning, it distills the data and represents it in a way that emphasizes the variability in the data set. So it finds the angle that warps the data in a way that increases the spread in that data over the temporal domain. And so machine learnings tend to they want to create the largest variability. And that's what this metric does essentially. And it sort of picks up on nuanced physiological features that don't necessarily exist in the electrogram space or may exist between the electrograms. For example, the distinguishing, in a very complex world, but it's also machine learning. So the explanations for it get pretty fun. But yes, we're distilling an entire episode captured across all electrodes into a single representation. And that representation may be more sensitive to ischemia than any of these metrics we're talking about. But we have to determine that first. Any other questions? Oh, sorry. Okay. And now looking at those same things spatially, there's different ways we can integrate that information in order to develop a different picture spatially. So for example, we can come up with a run metric for a single electrode like we did in the previous slide. So this is a single electrode, and that's that run metric created from that single electrode. But for example, what if we want to distill across the sock, for example? Do we include all electrodes? Do we include some electrodes? And how does that change our depiction of that event, right? So here on the left, we see the development of the intramural ischemia in the wall of the heart. And in the middle picture, we see that what the sock looks like at that same time point in the ischemic episode, right? And we see quite a lot of heterogeneity. There's a lot of red here sort of overlying the ischemic region. And if I showed you the posterior, there's a lot of blue, right? And so how do we want to actually capture this, and how do we want to measure the evolution of this episode? This is SD40 we're looking at. I should have mentioned that. So we're looking at SD40 across the sock. We're looking at a thresholded SD40 within the volume. And what we see in D and E, D is the average of all electrodes on the sock in their SD40 value over time. And E is if we only look at the electrodes with elevations. And so, which one do we want to use to represent the ischemic response for SD40? And we found that using the distilled episode, basically giving the SD40 everything it needs to make it as good of a metric as possible, was what we wanted to go do going forward. Because what we found is the machine learning metric we implemented can do this sort of ignoring irrelevant nodes on its own. And it wasn't a fair competition to compare the machine learning metric to these full epicardial metrics. So we came up with an algorithm to refine it to just this region. So our temporal metrics are spatially aggregated, but in a smarter way than just the entire sock, if that makes sense. Any other questions?
So C is just it's the same thing with just the points removed from the machine learning.
Oh, no, sorry. This is the SD40 metric. This is a separate algorithm that found the relevant region of the sock, not a machine learning algorithm.
Oh, okay.
So what it did is it found the most elevated neighborhood, something in this sort of area, And then it found like, what's my average value? And then it grew if the adjacent electrodes were within a certain parameter from that average value. So it sort of just expanded to cover it if it was contiguously elevated.
Okay, got it.
Yeah. Okay, any other questions?
So just to make sure, so elevation in this case is the highest voltage, and then sort of spreading out from there based on the parameter you're just saying?
Well, yeah, so that's how I did it. Yeah, so I found the I found the neighborhood that had the highest elevation, and then expanded that neighborhood if the adjacent neighborhoods were within some threshold from that original value. I believe it was within one standard deviation of the first neighborhood. Then it would expand to a second neighborhood, and that would keep going. If it was within one standard deviation of the original neighborhood, I wouldn't update the criteria. Okay. Oh, now I can't see what I'm saying. What is that? Hold on. Okay. Now we're going to get into some geometric-based metrics. So these perhaps might be, you might have heard of some of these. So these, what I wanted to look at, this is now getting into some of the conduction velocity studies where we're looking at our needle and sock recordings during a typical episode of this, in measuring propagation phenomena. And one thing we were interested in is how well could we reconstruct the propagation wavefront given the electrode sock and the intramural needles we have, right? So we only have a finite number of electrodes in these domains, and we can only make sampling and we can only record at those locations. But we want to be able to represent the entire heart and the entire volumes. So with just this sampling, so the sampling in B and F, for example, how well can we sample what's in A and E? Does that make sense? And it turns out that with a sock, we can reconstruct the activation sequence extremely well, and with the needles, we can do a pretty good job of reconstructing the activation sequence. And there's two metrics we went about with this. One, sort of a standard metric that's used pretty globally, not globally, but pretty universally, and what I'm going to call a more intuitive metric, a metric that sort of gives you something to think about in terms of the quality. So the first one is this RMSE, so the RMS error. And you can see those values represented in that table there. So we have the 2D RMSE and the 3D RMSE, right? But a second measure we have, which is what I call the percent of nodes under 1 millisecond of error, is how many nodes in the domain of interest are within 1 millisecond of their true value. And I feel like that gives you a better intuitive measure of how well the reconstruction was, rather than 0.2, right? And so some people will like seeing the RMSE because it's a very standard metric, and some people may not be able to interpret that in a way that makes sense. And so that's why I'm hoping the percent under 1 millisecond is more apt. Does that make sense? Any questions here?
How did you create the ground truth? Because you're trying to model you're like reconstructing the ground truth, but how did you get the ground truth to begin with?
Yeah, simulations.
Okay.
So we simulated an activation sequence, and then we simulated sampling that activation sequence with our recording electrodes. And then using only what we were able to sample with our recording electrodes, can we reconstruct the truth?
Okay. Okay, that makes sense, yeah.
And then there's obviously these more standard metrics, which are literally just geometric measures of the recording arrays themselves. For example, surface area per electrode, average edge length on the sock, envelope volume, how much tissue is actually taken up by the needle envelope itself, how many needles we used, and the amount of volume sampled by each needle. These are pretty intuitive, I think, but these are also metrics that we use in our studies. Right, so our socks have an average edge length of about 6.5 millimeters, right? They cover about 36 millimeters squared across the epicardium. These are, useful measures to have. How about mesh metrics? So I didn't show any of these, but I talked about them a couple weeks ago when I talked about meshes. Are there anything you guys can think of or remember that we mentioned when we're talking about meshes?
I mean, number of faces you have.
Yes. Yeah. So people will be like, how many elements does your mesh have? Right. And what is that a measure of?
Essentially how close your points are. I'm trying to put it in a way that makes sense. How densely packed your points are, or how many points you're using to recreate it. I want to say how precise, but I feel like that's not the right word. Like how precise your collection was.
It's sort of used as precision. Like obviously as it's got issues, right? There's tons of things that they don't normalize, right? Just knowing the number of things that do something doesn't really tell you much, right? Knowing that 7 billion people are all on a planet doesn't tell you much if they're all in Utah, right? So it's obviously not a perfect measure, but in for example, in a certain domain, when everybody's meshing the same thing in theory, that the number of elements tells you sort of the precision or the resolution of your mesh, right? If we're all talking about a heart, right, and you say, okay, I did it with 4 million elements and I did it with 12 million elements, then you can assume that the 12 million one is probably a higher resolution, even though, that heart could be 5 times bigger, in which case it's probably the same resolution, right? Does that make sense? But yeah, so people do use it as sort of an impromptu resolution quantity. Rob, Jake, correct me if I'm wrong. Rob, Jake, Brian, yeah. But
I think if you're talking to a computer scientist, they use it as a metric of how much RAM you will use in your computer. Right. So there's it depends on your context significantly.
Yeah. Yes, very much so. Very much so. Lindsay, what's the big mesh measure we're concerned with?
Big measure for the carp ones?
Yeah.
Isn't it just like edge length? So we need it to be small enough so that it actually gives us the resolution we want, but also not too big so that we're not waiting hours and hours.
Yeah, exactly. Basically, we need to get our edge lengths between each node fine enough that we're not guessing over too long of a distance. And with carp, that magic number is 600 microns. So our edge lengths need to be around 600 microns. So those are just some mesh measures. And then there's measures of how good of quality your different elements are. And that's just the different angles. You can draw the biggest circle that'll fit within a triangle and then do the ratio between that and the circle that'll inscribe the circle, the inscribe-circumscribe ratio, things like that. Those are all different mesh metrics, for example. Okay, so correlation-based metrics. These are things we do a lot of, and this changes even within our field, how we do these and how we talk about things. So, for example, we can look at temporal correlation. How correlated are these two events in time, right? And this becomes interesting, at least to me, at least, in the case of the evolution of conduction speed versus in ischemic stress. So what we're looking at is how correlated in time is the increase in ST40 or ischemic stress and a decrease in conduction speed. So I've inverted the conduction speed here. So the correlations I'm talking about are inverse correlations. But what we found is that these are 4 example run metrics down at the bottom there. And these are the same run metric type language we showed in the previous slides. And we found that these episodes are on average 91% correlated in time when we looked at the average run metrics for the entire needle envelope. But what we wanted to do is we wanted to look at every element in the mesh and see how the temporal correlation varied. So how the temporal correlation varied spatially. Does that make sense? So we calculated the ST run metric for every element in the mesh and the conduction speed changes for every element in the mesh. And we did the temporal correlation. And we found that the spatial component of this is much less correlated. So these events are happening in time at the same time points, but they're not happening as much in the same regions. And what this seems to, as I've interpreted this a little bit more, This seems to be a result of the endocardium and epicardium being much less correlated than the mid-myocardium. And I could go into safety factor type arguments and boundary arguments, but that's sort of beyond this conversation. Basically, as you encounter surfaces in propagation, your propagations change slightly, as well as your ischemic regions. Basically, you can't activate as much tissue if you're ischemic than if you can if you're healthy. Also, you're much more, your propagation strength is much weaker if you're propagating along a surface relative to the volume. So there's lots of things that come into play when thinking about propagation, but things get very difficult around surfaces, right? And Brian sort of intonated that in past lectures as well. A volumetric thing, you can think of, I think I've used the submarine bubbles crashing against the ocean surface, right? I mean, you can get an idea of what's going on, but it's not a perfect depiction. And then taking an idea of things hitting it at a slanted angle, not just an upward angle, and all these other things that you can imagine could complicate this story quite a bit. Oh, yeah, I didn't realize I had this picture. So now we're looking at the temporal correlation over space. And so we have this volume of tissue here, that needle envelope that I've mentioned. And for every node, we looked at the temporal correlation. And the green here is mid-myocardium, blue and red being endo and epi, right? And yeah, like I said, it's about, on average, I think it was 0.6, 60% spatial temporally correlated versus 92% temporally correlated, right? So it's obviously a much more complicated game than we assume. So we're looking at what we call the ground truth for ischemic stress development, this ST40 value, but we're also watching something that's very much so the result of ischemic stress, this propagation-based changes, and they're not occurring in the same space, right? So this gives you a pretty complicated picture that's essentially meaning that this ischemia is pretty global across the whole beat, and it has pretty far-reaching consequences when it comes to various regions of the electrograms. Now we can get into spatial correlation, right? And I don't actually have the values, but based on what I think, I'm pretty sure the spatial correlation between the two upper ones are on the order of about 90% to 95%. Jake, is that about right?
Sorry. Yeah, it depends on the situation. But for the cage, we're getting upwards of that level.
Yeah, this is the cage paper. This is the whatever. Yeah. So we might want to look at a single time point. So I believe this is the peak of the QRS, and we're looking at the peak of the QRS displayed across a measurement and our forward solution. So basically, if we take what we measured on the cage and then propagate it to the forward surface using all the fancy math Jake has explained in the past, right? So we want to look at how well we did at sort of recreating the measured surface, right? So how well correlated across space, right? Because we're only looking at a single time instant here. So how well are these two things correlated in space? And what we found is on the order of about 95%, right? But even at 95% spatial correlation, there's still a great deal of error. But we would say that's manageable error for sure. Right, and just in the same way that we could look at temporal correlation over space, we can look at spatial correlation over time, right? So here at the bottom, we have example electrograms or electrocardiograms. I'm not sure, my screen's okay. 0.2 millivolts per ohm, so that's probably body surface. So we're looking at electrocardiograms, and we're looking at the spatial correlation over time. Right, so this is the temporal progression. So instead of just looking at the peak of the QRS, we're looking at every time point in between and before, right? And so depending on how you slant the data, you can basically make different analyses. So is the spatial correlation sensitive to time? It seems to be there's some time points that are less accurate, but it's pretty high throughout the whole thing, which is encouraging to see, right?
Hey, just to pause for a moment, I want to make sure I'm understanding this. So with the correlation you're looking at, you're looking at the ground truth versus your model?
For which one?
I don't know.
Are you talking about the body surface ones or the conduction speed ones?
I don't know. I'm too confused now. Okay.
So these graphs right here are showing spatial correlation at each time instant, and the thing that's being correlated is the simulated torso surface potentials and the measured torso surface potentials.
Okay. Yeah, that answered it.
Okay. And now how to compare metrics, or at least how we've compared metrics in the past. And there'll be a general one too. So one thing I was particularly interested in, and I didn't feel was captured in the literature, was sort of capturing how quickly a metric evolves, right? There's one thing to say, my metric calls out the truth better than this other metric, right? Sort of the ROC type formulation, which we'll get into soon. Sort of the binary distinction, yes or no, right? My metric is very good at saying yes when the cases are diseased and no when it's healthy, right? That's what people are mostly concerned about. But for what if we were concerned about how quickly it responds and how robust that response is, right? And so that's something we were interested in, and this is getting back into those machine learning studies that we were in previously, and we're looking at 4 metrics over a same episode of ischemia. So we're looking at the LE metric, which is our machine learning metric, the ST40 metric, QRS integral, taking the QRS integral over time, and the integral of the T wave, right? And we see the evolution of these metrics over an episode of ischemia. And from this plot, we can say that the LE metric seems to have it starts from a pretty baseline level and it shoots out of it to a pretty high level pretty quickly, right? And so it seems to have a pretty robust response and a very quick response, right? And so we came up with some measures of doing those calculations, and indeed we found that the LE metric does respond faster and more robustly. So that was cool to see, right? So if we want a way of detecting ischemia earlier, then we can use, say, the ST segment, for example. And even so, you can perhaps use the T wave rather than the ST segment. It'll detect it on the order of 10 seconds earlier, but that's not necessarily significant. Right? Does that make sense? And we can do the same thing on the torso surface. So the previous one was on the epicardium. We can also do it on the torso surface. And what we see the same story. The LE metric detects it even faster relative to the other metrics. And more robust. Oh, sorry, on the torso surface, it is not more robustly. Actually, the ST40 has the most robust response on the torso surface, which is a good thing going for the ST40 metric. Right? And as we look at how these responses change, I'm not saying that these are these are representative. These were the ones chosen in the highest peaks and the most extreme ischemic regions. So we have 3 electrodes from the needle volume, we have 3 on the epicardial surface, and 3 on the torso surface. And you can see how different those responses are. For example, the QRSs are quite stable on the torso surface, besides that J point increase that happens mid-episode and goes away at the peak of the episode, which is a fun one. You see that? So I have met apprehensions with the J point, Michael. That's the J point, right? You brought up the J point, right, Michael? I'm not.
Yeah. I tried talking about it earlier.
Okay. So yeah, that's an example of a J point shift here, sort of a prototypic J point shift.
Mm-hmm.
An early after depolarization or something. Yeah. Okay, so the more traditional way of doing these measures is an ROC curve, right? A receiver operator characteristic curve. And this looks at how well, what does an ROC curve tell us? I think Ben got it last time, so Nate?
Yeah, so basically the sensitivity is telling you how often you detect something when something is going on, or you correctly identify that something is going on. While specificity is that 1 minus specificity. I know that the upper left is good, and that the 1 minus specificity
it's the opposite of sensitivity, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, it's not catching or not having any false alarms, right?
Yeah,
Correctly. Go ahead, Michael.
One's like false positives and the other is like false negatives. You can like tell from the two.
Yes. Sensitivity is correctly identifying the true positives, and the specificity is correctly identifying the true negatives.
Yeah.
And those have to do with the false positive ratios and the false negative ratios. Yeah, exactly. And that's sort of summarized, right? That second order metric we're talking about with area under the curve, right? And so in summary, the LE had the highest discriminatory performance as well. So it could rightfully identify true positives and true negatives more often than the other metrics, with the unsurprising T waves falling to the bottom of that. In our field, we always say T wave changes, they happen pretty early, but they also happen because the door opened. So you can't really trust them. So we showed that too. They have a pretty early response, pretty robust response, but it also has a pretty non-discriminatory response. Okay. I think that's it. Yeah, that's all I had for metrics. That was a lot, but hopefully it was a relatively good spread of metrics we use, how we think about the metrics, and how you can think about metrics. Flipping on its head, looking at a metric over time, looking at a metric over space, looking at a metric over n of some sort. Right, there's stratifying a metric in some capacity over another data axes tells a different story. Right, and going from looking at ST40s to looking at the ST40 evolution in that sort of run metric type space is already increases the power of what you can say about that metric. Right, you can start characterizing what's the average evolution, what's the point at which it starts at. Right, what's the point at which it peaks at. If it plateaus, what's the point at which it plateaus at? And those are things that are sort of masked unless you actually distill it down into this sort of run metric type space. And so that's just a very simple way of thinking about data, right?
And then if I can sort of throw in another, complementary perspective, because this covered it really nicely. And it comes back to Nate's question about the origins, if you will, of the machine learning derived metric. And you could just easily ask the question, well, why ST40? Right? What you know the answer because you look at ECGs and you know that that's where ECGs change. And that's sort of typical of metrics that we derive from some forethought or foreknowledge or previous experience or expectation or just theoretical assumption. I mean, there's all kinds of very solid reasons to say, I think there's going to be a change here because here's what the change reflects. And then there's other times, and this is what we're seeing more and more often, in sort of the world of science in general, where there is no knowledge that goes in. There's just data that go in, and some kind of algorithm that is, as Wilson says, creates large variances over some sequence of data sets, and that and so that the driver there is just to create difference, if you will, and be sensitive to those differences. And maybe sometimes it has some notions of orthogonality. I mean, there's all kinds of other sort of data-driven constraints, and they can yield useful things, like we're arguing at the moment that this LE metric does, and they can have even utility. And we're certainly seeing that in the whole world of machine learning and artificial intelligence, in separating patients into healthy and sick and all this sort of good stuff. But what do you think the big downside is? So when you pick a metric like the LE metric, what's a weakness in a metric that's just driven by the data like that?
I mean, my initial thought is it's because it's wholly driven by the data. If you don't have good data or high quality data, then you can machine learn it to not recognize the right things, or it's not going to perform as well if it doesn't have as great quality of data.
Right. That's definitely a great point. You need a certain amount of data and typically with more data comes more confidence, but you need quality data, and that oftentimes means well annotated data, or data that, you know, have the sort of signal to noise that is maybe representative. I mean, if you get really super fancy clean data, then you can yield metrics that never work in the real world, because real world images or signals are dirty and they have noise and crap in them. So those are, you know, requirements that we always have to meet with that. But, and that's a really good answer. Another sort of perspective that I'm trying to tease out is when that, let's say that LE metric changes, do you have any idea why it changes? Can you take a change and feed it back to physiology or something, you know, behavioral, you know, something mechanistic fundamentally?
I guess my initial thought is it'd be difficult to point to a specific thing and say this is the mechanism which causes change in our AI, because I mean, you set up the AI and it kind of goes, and I don't really know how that part works, and maybe that's why I'm a little hesitant. But I'd say that's probably it. No, it'd be difficult to say this happened here and that's why we saw this result, because the AI is kind of just going by itself, recognizing whatever it recognizes.
Yeah. So it's really hard to you know, make those connections, and you know, because whereas if you saw a change in ST40 and you understood where ST40 came from, you understood, okay, ST40 comes from blah 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 blah, and if it gets bigger, then that means some other thing is different in some way that, you know, at least, you know, there's not perfect precision always, but at least you can point to some aspect of the physiology of the mechanism, say, okay, that's, you know, that's where something's changing, and that can be very informative when you think of, you know, the goal of this all is to understand the system. You know, arguably clinically, it's to understand who's healthy and who's not, and who gets which drug. But you know, from a more basic perspective, it's to understand, you know, data reveals the behavior of a system, right? This is what engineers are good at. They take something, they bonk it, they shake it, they tap it, they heat it, they cool it, they do stuff with it, and out eventually comes this sort of, oh, I've got a bottle, you know, and here are the characteristics of a bottle, and you know, oftentimes with these machine learning approaches, that connection is at least obscured, if not completely, you know, absent.
Yeah, and you'll definitely see examples, and if you ever take a machine learning course, there are the sort of prototypical cases you go through are simple enough systems that the parameters that we're sort of calling physiology with the ischemia game, but with different systems, it's not physiology or whatever, it's velocity or something. But these will sometimes pan out to be directly on axis. So we saw this shape, you know, it's a 3D shape. There's 3 axes of interest. It's sometimes the case that one of those axes, or all of them, are tied to parameters you know and love. That is definitely the vast minority of cases. That doesn't happen very often, and sometimes you get one axis that you can make sense of, and people are ecstatic at it, right? But more often than not, the variability comes by combining 2 things that we would think of. So, hey, if you combine temperature and pressure and call that an axis, we're gonna then that skews the data in this way and tells a different story, right? And so you might not be aware of that. Like you have this manifold, this shape, and say, okay, I'm gonna run this algorithm again, but I'm gonna crank up temperature just to see how that influences my space, right? I want to learn what this change along this axis is. So I dial up temperature, and it changes a little bit, but not in the way I expected. So it's clear that the change along this axis is influenced by temperature, but it's not clear if that's divided by pressure times by that time, right? It's not clear what that function is, or strictly temperature between 2 nodes in your system, right? You're not sure what it's picking up on, and different systems do different things. Like maximizing variability is one class of machine learning systems. So there's caveats to all of them, of course, but the massive thing you lose, and this is the trade-off everyone talks about, is understanding. A lot of the times it's unclear why the machine learning metric is doing better, but we can show using typically ROC curves with every standard metric Like, so they'll code up every standard metric, and then they'll throw in the fancy novel machine learning metric and then say, it's better. So if you're trying to discriminate, it's better. It won't tell you much about the system, but if you're trying to discriminate, it will do that, right? So if you're trying to come up with a recommendation for what movie to watch after watching horror movies all day, right? It'll give you that. It won't be able to tell you why it recommended that horror movie necessarily, but it will give you a horror movie, right? So that's good enough for some use cases, right? And so you can imagine that. However, yeah, exactly. You can't necessarily understand how they came to that conclusion. They couldn't tell you either. They would tell you something of like, oh yeah, they might come up with names for them. So this axis is consumer score A, consumer score B, right? Things like that, which are a combination of wealth, social, like you can imagine all these things that sort of come into the various axes that they may or may not be aware of. And so the machine learning is very attractive because it can find things. They can find the right knob positions for your system to accentuate your data in a really nice way. But sometimes you lose a lot of context. It's a very good point.
Yeah, and just to sort of hopefully make the circle not complete, but to bring it even more back to ski, we actually have somebody in the institute whose whole approach to machine learning is to try and perturb the machine learning and the data that go into it to sort of do what Wilson was suggesting, where he said you heat it up and you see what happens to the system, and so he has data sets that he can manipulate, and so he manipulates the data in controlled ways, and then observes the behavior of the machine learning output variable or the connections or some other feature of the actual neural network that's behind it all, and with this goal in mind, to be able at the end of the day say, why is it that this algorithm does better than the other? Why, what's the key feature in that video that tells us that we're about to hit a telephone pole versus just a rope hanging down somewhere, in our computer driven car, automated car.